Mari, there was a time when women had no rights regarding politics. So what was it that provoked them into taking action, into getting the right to vote, and what took so long?
The first time that a woman really asked for the vote in this country was probably 1832, when we got the first recorded petition of a woman asking for the vote to Parliament. Women were excluded, along with the great sort of majority of the population, from politics, and you get the first petition presented to Parliament from a large number of women that was presented to Parliament by John Stuart Mill in 1865, and for the first time it gets debated properly in the House of Commons, and it fails, of course, but it encourages the women to go on, and many working class men could not vote. There was no point trying to really give it to women either. And so some women started to get frustrated by this. And so in the early 20th century, the movement starts to become militant, or rather a militant sort of wing grows up of the suffrage movement. And then in 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union is formed by Emmeline Pankhurst and other women who were impatient with the slow pace of change, and they used more militant tactics.
Do you think this was needed in order to progress the movement, in order to achieve what they wanted?
I think it's important to remember that although the militants, the people using direction, were a very small number, their sort of action meant that suddenly many hundreds of thousands of women joined the constitutional, the peaceful suffrage movement as well, so it gave them publicity as well.
There was a huge class divide even back then.
There was. It's important to remember there were working class women's suffrage campaigners, always were, going way back. And among the suffragettes, absolutely, there were working class suffragettes and as well as suffragists, the peaceful campaigners. It's actually the First World War that really changes everything and enables some women to get the vote after that.
Is that because they had to then take up male jobs whilst a lot of the men were away at war?
That's part of it, absolutely. The other reason that the war was important is because it meant that the working class men who still could not vote, it was something like 40% of men still could not vote by 1914, they really had to have the vote because they were the ones going off losing their lives in enormous numbers and fighting. And so they had to pass an Act of Parliament to enable all men to have the vote. In 1918, you get women over the age of 30 who met minimum property qualifications being allowed to vote. Now, both those things are important. The age 30 is important because the reason for that was because if you'd given women the vote on the same terms as men, the women would have outnumbered the men because so many men died in the war, and that was not politically acceptable.
Obviously, culturally it was different at that time, but there seemed to have been a very huge fear factor around women entering into politics.
Yes. So for the parliamentarians, of course, Parliament had always been a male space throughout the centuries. Now, women had been there in the fringes, but, in the tea rooms or watching from the ladies' gallery or watching, if you go back a couple of hundred years, women used to have to watch debates through a ventilator shaft in the ceiling so that men couldn't see that women were watching them. So women were there, but they were around the edges. And suddenly from 1918, you have the possibility that women might be there in the building. And there was a real resistance to this among some men. You get Nancy Astor, who was the first woman MP to take her seat. She was a real trailblazer, and she had to be because she was the only one. And so she had to walk into the House of Commons on day one as the only woman there.
The contribution to the suffragette movement by minority women is virtually unknown. What role did they play, if any?
There were certainly Indian suffragettes. There's a photograph in the Museum of London that shows a delegation of Indian women marching in coronation procession in 1911. There were other specific groups such as there was a Jewish League for Women's Suffrage as well, which was founded in 1912 and carried on campaigning for some years. So women were definitely there, minority women, but not always easy to find.